What if everything you thought you knew about history was just the boring part? Forget kings and battles, this is history's unhinged backroom. Golden peas, farting professionals, and Viking divorce law. 53 of the weirdest, wildest, and most what the fuck facts you were never taught in school because your teachers had boundaries. This isn't a timeline, it's a slow spiral into the beautifully bizarre minds of the past, and by the end, you'll be asking not, did this really happen, but why did this happen? Strap in, history's about to get extremely weird. Before we dive headfirst into the madness, take a second to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. We've got plenty more strange corners of history waiting for you. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Ohio? 3 a.m. in Manila? We want to know who else is wide awake and wondering how beavers ended up in medieval courtrooms. Roman Emperor Elagabalus once served peas made of gold at a banquet. Elagabalus wasn't your average Roman emperor. He didn't conquer much, legislate anything useful, or even bother to look particularly imperial. What he did do better than almost anyone else in history was throw a party so extravagantly pointless it makes today's influencer yacht trips look like sack lunches in a parking lot. At one such banquet, Emperor Elagabalus decided that food was just too edible, too obvious. So, in an act of culinary protest or maybe just pure troll energy, he served peas made of solid gold. Actual metallic spheres, not plated delicacies. No spice, no sauce, no nutritional value, just a bowl full of suffering for anyone with teeth. And the best part? His guests were expected to react as if this was normal. Imagine sitting there, starving, staring into a shimmering bowl of what might as well be currency marbles, while the emperor giggles behind a fan. That's not dinner, it's psychological warfare in appetizer form. Of course, Elagabalus wasn't big on subtlety. This is the same man who released wild animals into dinner parties for entertainment. The same man who covered guests in rose petals until some suffocated. The same man who allegedly invented the whoopee cushion, but Roman. So, gold peas? Just another Tuesday. Naturally, the Senate hated him. The people feared him. And the historians? They had an absolute field day. Because in the long scroll of history, no one forgets the emperor who weaponized legumes. Which begs the question, what kind of mind thinks this feast needs more metallurgy? The kind, perhaps, that knows deep down he's not long for the throne and decides to burn down the concept of hospitality on the way out. But Elagabalus wasn't the only one with a flair for the dramatic. Because just a bit further north, some very fashionable Vikings were giving personal grooming a surprisingly savage twist. Vikings used bones to comb their hair. Vikings, the terrifying, axe-wielding berserkers of the north who pillaged monasteries, conquered cities, and had excellent hair care routines. Beneath the blood-splattered armor and the howling war cries, these guys took their grooming very, very seriously, and they weren't above turning a battlefield into a beauty supply store. Enter the bone comb. Made from animal bones, or if you really wanted to make a statement, the skulls of enemies, these combs weren't just tools, they were trophies. Imagine flossing your beard with the ribcage of a guy you just decapitated. That's not hygiene, that's performance art. And why all the effort? Simple. Viking society valued appearance almost as much as violence. Dirty nails, shameful, tangled hair, practically treason. Their graves often included grooming kits, which means you could literally take your comb to Valhalla. Some accounts even suggest these warriors would spend as much time preening as praying. You know, just in case the gods were into symmetrical braids. Because when you believe you'll spend eternity fighting and feasting, you don't want to show up looking like you slept in a barn even if you did. But let's not romanticize too much. This wasn't some ancient Scandi salon. These were brutal people doing brutal things who happened to hate dandruff. It's like if your barber also burned down villages. And yet, there's something darkly admirable about the juxtaposition. Kill, pillage, cleanse, exfoliate. It's chaos with conditioner. But if you thought having a bone comb made from your enemies was intense, wait until you meet the Roman god who blessed your door hinges. The ancient Romans had a god of door hinges. Yes, the same civilization that gave us aqueducts, legal codes, and gladiator arenas also devoted divine worship to hinges. Enter Cardea, the goddess of door pivots. Not war, not wisdom hinges. Praise be to smooth rotations. Cardea wasn't just some fringe deity either. She was officially part of the Roman spiritual lineup. Because in a world filled with literal gods of manure and mildew, hinge worship was practically mainstream. Why hinges? Because the Romans believed that doorways were liminal spaces, thresholds between order and chaos, the known and the unknown. So, naturally, the tiny creaking contraption that let your door swing open deserved sacred protection. Without her blessing, you might as well leave the door open and invite in the Furies. She was also considered a protector of children, which sounds noble until you realize that, functionally, her divine role was making sure the nursery door didn't squeak, a celestial babysitter with WD-40. And yet, it's kind of poetic. The ancient world was dangerous, superstitious, and full of curses, so people needed to believe that even the smallest parts of their lives were watched over. If your door creaked in the night, it wasn't bad carpentry, it was an angry goddess. Religion meets home maintenance. Also, let's be real, any civilization that wiped their butts with communal sponges probably should pray before entering a room. But if hinge worship feels a little too domestic, just wait. Because while the Romans prayed for smooth door swings, the Assyrians were faking their own funerals just to see who'd show up. Assyrian kings would sometimes fake their own deaths. There's preparing for death, and then there's throwing yourself a surprise funeral. The Assyrian kings, ever the innovators of paranoia, decided that the best way to know what people really thought of you was to pretend you were dead and see who cried, then take notes. Imagine being the most powerful man in the world and still thinking, yeah, but do they really like me? These rulers would stage elaborate mock deaths, complete with royal announcements, mourning rituals, and full-blown national grieving. The court would go into mourning. Priests would begin rites. People would wail in the streets, and then surprise. His Majesty walks out alive and well, dramatically brushing funeral dust off his robes like, "Just kidding, I'm not dead, just disappointed." The psychology behind this is equal parts Shakespearean drama and corporate performance review. Faking your death to test loyalty is one thing. Coming back from it and remembering who didn't look sad enough, that's an HR nightmare. You didn't cry hard enough? Enjoy being reassigned to goat patrol in the desert. And, of course, there were consequences. Some courtiers would overact, wailing like opera singers just to be safe. Others stayed quiet and mysteriously vanished afterward. Nothing builds a better company culture than the threat of death for not grieving creatively enough. There's a twisted brilliance in this tactic. It's reverse espionage. Instead of catching people plotting behind your back, you catch them thinking you're gone, and then decide if they deserve to stay. It's like if your boss faked a resignation just to see who gossiped. And in a world where the throne was a target and betrayal was a hobby, you couldn't be too careful. The Assyrians knew the knife in the back usually came from someone who bowed the lowest. But while they were busy staging funerals, another empire was building something even more dramatic. Something they would never explain, never share, and possibly couldn't replicate. The Byzantine Empire once had a secret weapon called Greek fire. Picture this. It's the 7th century, and you're on a wooden ship, minding your imperial business, when suddenly the sea itself catches fire. That wasn't divine punishment. That was the Byzantine navy, and they had just unleashed a secret so terrifying, even water couldn't put it out. Greek fire was the medieval equivalent of a cheat code. It was a liquid weapon, probably petroleum-based, that ignited on contact and kept burning, even on water. Flames danced across the sea, devouring enemy fleets like kindling. Sailors panicked, boats exploded, and the Byzantines? They just watched from their decks, smug and untouchable. The exact formula? Lost to history. Deliberately. The recipe was a state secret so tightly guarded that not even allies were trusted with it. The empire survived sieges and naval wars because of this one terrifying invention, and then, when they fell, the formula fell with them. Historians have speculated for centuries. Was it crude oil, quicklime, sulfur, or powdered unicorn horn? We'll never know. It was handed down orally between military engineers like some infernal family recipe, a recipe that cooked people alive. What makes it even more absurd is how lo-fi the delivery system was. Bronze tubes shaped like lion heads shot the flaming liquid across ships, flame-throwing lions, on boats. It sounds like a metal album cover, but it was real. This wasn't just a weapon, it was a spectacle, a psychological nuke. Enemies would rather retreat than risk facing it, because what good is armor when the ocean itself is trying to barbecue you? The Byzantines may have been shrinking, besieged from all sides, but with Greek fire, they became legendary. Not because they had the biggest army, but because they had the scariest chemistry experiment no one else could replicate. Of course, it's one thing to fight wars with liquid hell. It's another to fight bugs with unpaid interns. Because in Egypt, the pharaohs didn't just rule their servants, they used them as human fly traps. In ancient Egypt, servants were sometimes covered in honey to keep flies off the pharaoh. Pharaohs, living gods on earth, worshipped as divine, buried in gold, and so allergic to inconvenience they invented full-time, sticky humans to deal with insects. Yes, in ancient Egypt, the royal court had a job title that can only be described as living bug zapper. When flies became too bothersome for the divine nostrils of a pharaoh, a servant or several would be slathered head to toe in honey and made to stand nearby. Their only purpose, attract flies away from the king. Let's break that down. You are poor, you're likely malnourished, and your daily responsibility is to stand in the sun, dripping in sugar, while being consumed by winged agony. No umbrella. No relief. Just you, the honey, and the angry hum of several thousand biting insects. And this wasn't a rare punishment. It was a standard practice, the cost of being close to royalty. You got to bask in the pharaoh's presence as long as you didn't mind becoming dessert. The image is absurd, sure, but it's also horrifying. A royal so untouchable, so sacred, that he needed other humans to act as sacrificial bait for pests. It's cruelty disguised as practicality. Divine delegation, one sticky body at a time. Even more surreal? There were probably palace fly-counting competitions. Hassan has 72 on him. The pharaoh is down to 4. Good work today, everyone. But this wasn't the strangest part of pharaonic life. Egypt's rulers were obsessed with order, mummification, rituals, sun cycles, and yet allowed this chaotic, buzzing horror to happen in the background of state affairs. Imagine treaties being signed while some poor guy stands in the corner, slowly becoming a raisin in the sun, knowing full well that his only crime was being born not royal. It's a special kind of power, when your comfort requires someone else's slow insect death. Still, it's not the worst gig in ancient history. That honor might go to the man who once told his kidnappers to raise his ransom and then came back for revenge. Julius Caesar was once kidnapped by pirates. Julius Caesar, the man who would go on to reshape Rome, cross the Rubicon, and get stabbed by half the Senate, once had his entire career temporarily paused by pirates. And not the fun rum-drinking kind, the real smelly kind, the kind who tie you to a mast and ask for pocket change in exchange for your life. At the time, Caesar was still young and not yet draped in eternal laurels. While sailing near the island of Pharmacusa, he was captured by Cilician pirates, entrepreneurial types, who specialized in sea-based extortion. They demanded a ransom of 20 talents of silver. Caesar, offended by the low number, insisted they ask for 50. That's right, he literally negotiated up his own ransom, like a man trying to get a better Yelp review. And then, for over a month, he lived among them. But he didn't act like a hostage. He treated the pirates like co-workers he didn't respect. He told them stories, recited poetry, gave critiques of their manners, and frequently reminded them casually that once he was free, he would return and crucify them all. They laughed. He didn't. Once the ransom was paid, Caesar was released. He immediately raised a small navy, hunted them down, and made good on his promise. Crucifixion for everyone. Though, in a display of what he probably called mercy and what we'd call PR damage control, he had their throats cut first. Just a little considerate touch. This story, tucked between military campaigns and imperial reforms, is pure Caesar. Arrogant, theatrical, vengeful, and weirdly charming. It's the tale of a man so sure of his own destiny that not even piracy could distract him from his plotline. He didn't escape from pirates. He allowed a dramatic pause in the story before returning to the main narrative. But if Caesar was the kind of man who wrote his own legend, Charlemagne was the type who needed props to convince people he could even hold a pen. Charlemagne couldn't write, but he insisted on carrying around wax tablets. Charlemagne, the great unifier of medieval Europe, was crowned Emperor of the Romans and credited with reviving learning, law, and literacy across a post-collapse continent. He also couldn't write. At all. Yes, the father of the Carolingian Renaissance, the man who pushed schools and scribes and standardized scripts across his empire, was functionally illiterate. He tried, don't get us wrong. He practiced writing in private. But his hands were trained for swords, not scribbles, and he never quite got the hang of it. That didn't stop him from pretending. Charlemagne famously carried around wax tablets, the medieval equivalent of walking into meetings with a MacBook open, screen off, just to look busy. People thought he was constantly writing things down. Really, he was probably just doodling angry faces and pretending they were legal reforms. But here's the twist. Charlemagne's illiteracy wasn't seen as a weakness. It was a quirk, a noble flaw. Because, remember, this was a time when most of Europe couldn't read anyway. And as long as he sounded smart and looked imperial, that was enough. He surrounded himself with scholars, like Alcuin of York, and created an empire obsessed with books even if he couldn't read them himself. It's the kind of leadership that screams, I don't know what I'm doing, but I've hired someone who does. So when he sat there with his wax tablets, nodding gravely, his court didn't laugh. They took notes. Literally. Because if the emperor looked like he was learning, then everyone else better start learning fast. It's a strange sort of genius, knowing your limitations, faking your strengths, and building a legacy out of people who could fill in the gaps. Charlemagne didn't need to write. He just needed to convince the world he could, and make sure someone else was writing down what mattered. Still, even with all the educational reform, there was no handbook for what the Visigoths were about to do to Rome, or how polite they'd be about it. The Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, and politely asked for directions out afterward. The year was 410 AD. Rome, the eternal city, the jewel of empire, the place where Caesar once strutted and senators once schemed, was being torn apart by invading Visigoths. And yet, it might have been the most well-mannered apocalypse in history. The Visigoths, led by King Alaric, were frustrated guests. They'd been promised land and protection as allies of Rome. Instead, they got bureaucratic delays and broken promises. So, like any slighted dinner guest, they eventually decided to burn the house down. What followed was a 3-day sack, Homes were looted, treasures seized, doors kicked in, and yet it was remarkably restrained. Churches were mostly spared. Many citizens survived. There were no rivers of blood or pyramid, piles of skulls, just highly focused robbery with surprisingly polite footnotes. And the kicker? When they were done, the Visigoths reportedly asked for directions out. Literally. "Excuse us, which road leads to the Appian Way?" Civilization had collapsed, but road etiquette endured. It's absurdly human. A marauding army levels one of the most powerful cities in history, then pauses to consult Google Maps. Imagine Attila the Hun stopping mid-rampage to ask a local peasant, "Left at the aqueduct?" Historians have marveled at the contradiction. This was a moment that symbolized the fall of Rome, a city that hadn't been sacked in 800 years. And yet, the sacking wasn't about pure destruction. It was more like a political tantrum with loot as compensation. It was the end of an era, carried out with the eerie calm of people who just wanted what they were owed. Rome didn't fall with screams, it fell with paperwork, broken promises, and one very awkward exit. But if you think that's where the weird ends, think again, because right around the corner, some Romans were reinventing public bathrooms and making you share the toilet paper. Roman toilets were communal, had no privacy walls, and people shared a single sponge on a stick for wiping. Ah, the glory of Rome. Temples, forums, aqueducts, and communal poop time with strangers. The same civilization that engineered marvels of architecture and law also decided that when nature calls, it should do so in a room full of other people, with zero privacy, and a shared sponge dipped in vinegar water as your only hope for cleanliness. Public Roman toilets weren't the kind of place you visited quietly. They were open-air, stone-seated social hubs, essentially boardrooms for bowel movements. Lining up along a bench with holes cut in the top and front, citizens would sit side by side, pants down, knees up, discussing politics, business, gladiator gossip, or who had the worst gas. And the toilet paper? Oh, there wasn't any. Instead, there was the tersorium, a communal sponge on a stick, stored in a trough of diluted vinegar, lovingly passed from one user to the next. A horrifying baton in the relay race of hygiene. "Pass the stick, Marcus," is a phrase that should have never existed. This wasn't considered gross. It was just normal. To a Roman, the idea of pooping alone would have seemed suspiciously antisocial. It's the ancient equivalent of someone leaving the party early. What are you hiding in there, exactly? The logic was utilitarian. Fewer resources, less infrastructure, more efficiency. But also, it reveals something about Roman culture, this odd blend of high achievement and base practicality. A society that could engineer the Colosseum couldn't quite wrap its head around personal bathroom space. And yet, even emperors weren't exempt. Lavish palaces had private latrines, sure, but the average Roman shared his most vulnerable moments with others, sometimes even over a casual conversation. So next time someone calls ancient Rome advanced, just remember, they wiped with a shared sponge and thought privacy was for barbarians. Of course, if you really want to feel exposed, try standing nude in front of a crowd, greased up like a roast chicken and ready to throw a javelin. Which brings us to ancient Greek athletes competed completely naked and oiled themselves up beforehand. Let's just say it. The ancient Olympics were less about sportsmanship and more about high-stakes nudity with competitive flair. Greek athletes didn't just train naked, they competed that way. And to make it extra dramatic, they coated themselves in olive oil first. Because nothing says victory like sprinting across a dusty field with your glistening bits leading the way. This wasn't a fringe practice. It was the norm. Athletes believed that the human body, in its purest, unclothed form, was an expression of strength, beauty, and divine symmetry. Also, clothes got in the way and slowed you down, so off they went, bearing it all for Zeus and glory. Spectators? Oh, There were plenty. Men, women, at least sometimes, and gods alike. The stadiums were packed with people watching toned bodies glisten and grapple, slip and slam. Wrestling was particularly intimate. The oil wasn't just for show either. It was believed to help muscles stay supple, protect against the sun, and reduce the risk of injury. Plus, it made it harder for your opponent to grab you, which, in naked wrestling, is already complicated enough. After the events, athletes would scrape the oil and sweat off their bodies with a metal tool called a strigil, and sometimes sell the mixture as a kind of celebrity bathwater. Yes, ancient Greece invented both the OnlyFans aesthetic and influencer skincare merch in one fell swoop. But behind the glamour was a deeply competitive, honor-obsessed culture. Victors were celebrated like demigods. Statues were erected. Poems were written. Losers, meanwhile, quietly oiled up and tried again in 4 years. This naked ambition wasn't just for show, it was spiritual. Athletics were a form of worship. Competing nude before the gods was a way to strip down to your essence, body, and soul. Still, if losing your loincloth in front of thousands sounds embarrassing, try going to war with the ocean itself, which is exactly what one Chinese emperor did. A Chinese emperor once declared war on the sea because his favorite pearl was lost. Some men wage war for glory, some for land. And then there's Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, who declared war on the ocean. Why? Because it swallowed his favorite pearl. That's it. The sea took something shiny, and he took it personally. This wasn't metaphorical. He didn't curse the sea in poetry. He assembled a literal army, marched it to the coastline, and ordered his soldiers to shoot arrows at the waves. Thousands of men, lined up in military formation, unleashing volleys into the water, as if Poseidon himself were hiding beneath the foam, clutching Wu's beloved gem. This wasn't a tantrum. It was imperial policy. Wu even conducted sacrificial rituals to punish the sea gods. The ocean had disrespected him, and he was going to teach it a lesson with arrows, spears, and possibly the world's first instance of passive-aggressive weather vengeance. One imagines the archers, ankle-deep in seawater, releasing volleys with all the enthusiasm of people who know they are participating in the most futile military campaign in history. Aim for the current. It looked at us funny. But in the emperor's mind, this was justice. The pearl wasn't just jewelry, it was a divine object, a symbol of favor. And when it vanished into the sea, it was seen not as an accident, but an insult. When you're emperor, even natural forces are expected to behave themselves. What's fascinating is the total sincerity of it. There was no irony, no satire, just a ruler so accustomed to power that when nature said no, he launched an invasion. And really, isn't that the story of empire in a nutshell? A man loses something precious, refuses to accept randomness, and burns half a coastline trying to fix it. Of course, if you think irrational vengeance ends at the shore, let's talk about another emperor, one who played music while his city burned, and whose legacy went up in smoke right alongside it. Emperor Nero reportedly played the lyre during the Great Fire of Rome. The city of Rome was burning, and Nero was jamming, or so the story goes. In 64 AD, a fire swept through the Eternal City, consuming entire districts, incinerating homes, and leaving tens of thousands homeless. It raged for 9 days, turning temples into ash and livelihoods into glowing rubble. But the most enduring image wasn't the fire itself, it was the emperor, allegedly perched on a balcony, strumming his lyre while chaos unfolded below. Now, historically, there's no solid proof that Nero literally played music while watching his city burn. But the rumor stuck. Why? Because it felt true. This was Nero. After all, a man so enamored with performance and ego that the idea of him treating a catastrophe like an opening act seemed completely believable. Some sources say he sang a song about the fall of Troy, as Rome crumbled, because subtlety was not Nero's strength. To be fair, Nero did try to rebuild the city afterward. Wide streets, new building codes, marble facades, the whole urban refresh package. But then he also used the fire as an excuse to seize land and build his massive golden house, complete with artificial lake and rotating dining room, which, kind of undercut the disaster relief vibes. And if you're wondering who took the blame for the fire, it wasn't Nero. He pointed his imperial finger at a small, suspicious religious sect called the Christians. They were tortured, burned, and crucified en masse in what might be history's most politically motivated deflection. So whether he played the liar or not, Nero's reputation was set in stone and fire. He became the poster child for unchecked power, artistic delusion, and acoustics over empathy. And just when you think history can't possibly get pettier, it turns out ancient people were cracking yo mama jokes 3,500 years ago. The oldest known yo mama joke comes from Babylon. Long before TikTok, long before stand-up comedy, long before anyone thought to combine maternal references with cutting insults, there was Babylon. And someone there, with a clay tablet and a sharp tongue, decided to roast someone's mom. The joke, written in cuneiform on a fragile piece of mud, is one of the earliest surviving examples of humor, and yes, it's a yo mama joke. It's hard to translate directly. Ancient Akkadian isn't exactly optimized for punchlines, but scholars agree. The structure is familiar, the target is maternal, and the intent is pure shade. What's wild is not just that the joke exists, but that it was recorded. Someone thought, this joke is so good, it deserves to be etched into history. And it was, literally. In a tablet, with a stylus, by hand, one wedge at a time. That tells us a lot. For one, people haven't changed. Petty insults? Timeless. Targeting someone's mother for laughs? Eternal. And second, humor was culturally important enough to preserve alongside laws, taxes, and epic poems, which is frankly beautiful. But also, imagine being the scholar tasked with translating ancient texts, expecting to find noble truths about the dawn of civilization and discovering the equivalent of, yo mama so fat, she broke the ziggurat. The fact that humor like this existed at all suggests that sarcasm and mockery were thriving even in ancient societies. They had gods and laws and myths, and they also had guys making fun of each other's families behind the tavern. It's oddly comforting. Civilizations rise and fall, empires come and go, but somewhere, someone is always making fun of someone else's mom. And in a world of crude comedy, who better to serve as the cosmic trickster than a chaos-sowing squirrel from Viking mythology? Vikings believed in a squirrel god, named Ratatoskr. In Norse mythology, where gods throw hammers and wolves eat the sun, there exists a squirrel, not just any squirrel, Ratatoskr, the cosmic instigator. His job? To run up and down Yggdrasil, the world tree, carrying insults between the eagle at the top and the serpent at the roots. He didn't bring messages of peace. He wasn't a messenger of wisdom or goodwill. No Ratatoskr existed purely to stir the pot. His entire divine role was talking trash, literally. Viking mythology gave him a name, a purpose, and a divine commute, just to spread gossip. He is, by definition, the god of drama. Imagine a divine squirrel scampering through the universe, whispering, "You should have heard what the eagle said about your scales," and then sprinting back up with, "Oh, by the way, Nidhogger thinks your feathers look dumb." And what did this accomplish? Nothing constructive, just cosmic tension. But the Norse gods were fine with that. In a pantheon built on impending doom and constant betrayal, Ratatoskr was less comic relief and more the eternal fuel for grudges, a one-squirrel propaganda machine. The beauty is in how specific this character is. While other mythologies had gods of love, war, harvest, or wine, the Vikings said, "We also need someone to ruin everyone's day in small, passive-aggressive doses. Enter the squeaky-tailed troll of the tree." It makes sense, in a grim sort of way. The Norse worldview was shaped by hard winters, short lives, and inevitable Ragnarok. In that kind of universe, sometimes all you can do is laugh at the squirrel starting divine Twitter threads between ancient beasts. So yes, the Vikings had a war squirrel. And if that doesn't make your day better, wait until you hear about the ancient Persians, who made all their decisions twice, once drunk, once sober. Ancient Persians debated everything, twice once drunk and once sober. Some cultures meditate, some hold council. The ancient Persians, they popped a bottle and let the ideas flow. In the Achaemenid Empire, where gold flowed like wine and empires stretched across deserts, decision-making followed a simple but utterly chaotic two-step protocol. First, get absolutely hammered. Then, sleep it off and revisit the same idea stone-cold sober. If it passed both tests inebriated and rational, it was declared a good idea. If it only worked in one state of mind, tossed out like bad wine. It's the kind of policy that sounds like a terrible frat house rule until you realize how weirdly logical it is. The Persians weren't partying for fun, okay, maybe a little. They believed alcohol freed the soul, stripped away deceit, and revealed the unfiltered truth. Sobriety, in contrast, brought restraint, clarity, and caution. Put them together? Boom! Balanced governance via hangover. Imagine modern governments operating this way. Parliament sessions held in wine cellars, presidential debates slurred through shot glasses, laws passed only if they survived both tequila and tea. This was no metaphorical ritual either. There were actual councils where men sat in silk robes, goblets in hand, proposing tax reforms and military campaigns while swaying slightly to the rhythm of their own voices. The next day, the same group would sit in the same room, much quieter, probably nursing ancient headaches, and see if anything they'd said made sense. Somehow, it worked. Persia thrived. Empires grew. Ideas survived the great filter of dual consciousness. And, perhaps most importantly, it acknowledged that truth looks different when your inhibitions are down. The brilliance lies not in the drinking, but in the principle. Test ideas in extremes. Does your plan still hold up when stripped of polish and pride? Does it still seem smart when viewed through bloodshot eyes and a pounding skull? And if that idea still stands after all that, congratulations. You might just be the kind of man who deserves to name 20 cities after himself. Alexander the Great named over 20 cities after himself and one after his horse. There are power moves, and then there's Alexander the Great, undefeated in battle, crowned in 3 continents, and somehow still insecure enough to ensure his name echoed across every map he touched. Wherever he went, cities sprang up. And what did he name them? Alexandria, Alexandria, Alexandria. Again and again. It was less empire building and more extreme personal branding. At last count, historians note over 20 cities named Alexandria, not New Alexandria, not Alexandria on the river, just Alexandria. Like a man stamping his name on history so hard it echoes through geography. But wait, it gets better. Among all the self-flattering Alexandrias, there's one exception, Bucephala, named not after a general or a deity, but after his beloved horse, Bucephalus. Yes, he named a city after his horse, because loyalty, apparently, comes with naming rights. Bucephalus wasn't just a horse, he was the horse. Massive, untamable, and only rideable by Alexander, because of course. When the horse died after the Battle of the Hydaspes, Alexander built him a tomb and an entire city. Meanwhile, his soldiers got tense. This wasn't just sentimentality. It was PR, a calculated move to humanize a man who had conquered most of the known world before age 33. Alexander, conqueror, visionary, and emotional horse dad. The city naming spree also reveals something darker. A man obsessed with legacy, with permanence. Naming a city is easy. But naming it after yourself over and over again hints at a man who knows he won't last, and desperately wants the map to remember him. Spoiler alert, it worked. But even Alexander, with all his cities and horses, would have raised an eyebrow at what medieval monks were dunking in buckets to determine divine truth. Medieval monks used to put religious texts to the test by dunking them in water. Imagine a group of solemn monks, robed in wool and reverence, standing over a wooden bucket, in their hands, a sacred text. In their minds, one burning question: is this the real word of God? Their solution? Dunk it. In the Middle Ages, theological disputes weren't just settled with debates, they were occasionally solved with water-based trial by ordeal. Some monks genuinely believed that if a text were divinely inspired, it would survive being submerged. Pages intact, ink legible, God approved. If it dissolved or smeared, heresy. Case closed. It's hard to imagine how many handwritten, painstakingly illuminated manuscripts met a soggy, tragic end in those buckets. Pages that took months to copy, floating limp and ruined, because Brother Gregory suspected the Gospel of Thomas was a little too spicy. This practice, while not widespread, was part of a broader medieval tradition. If you couldn't reason it, torture it. Suspect your neighbor of witchcraft? Throw her in a river. Unsure if your cheese is blessed? Pray over it. Uncertain about your book? Drown it. It's simultaneously hilarious and heartbreaking. On one hand, the image of monks earnestly watching a soggy scroll disintegrate feels like Monty Python with a theological budget. On the other, it's a window into a world desperate for certainty, any certainty, in an age of chaos, plague, and superstition. There's also something metaphorically rich here. Truth that survives pressure. Words that endure the flood. It's poetic, dumb, but poetic. And yet, the idea that divine legitimacy could be determined by water damage makes you wonder what else passed for logic in the Middle Ages. Spoiler. An emperor once tried to make his horse a senator, and not just any horse, one with a marble stable and political dreams. Emperor Caligula tried to make his horse a consul. Caligula wasn't subtle. When Rome handed him the empire, he didn't just take the power, he smeared it all over the walls, licked it, and fed it oats, literally. His favorite companion wasn't a general or a senator, it was his horse, Incitatus. A horse so pampered, so exalted, so thoroughly confused about its role in society, that Caligula tried to appoint it consul. Yes, consul, as in head of state, a horse, in government. Incitatus had everything a respectable Roman citizen could dream of. A marble stable, an ivory trough, a purple blanket, the imperial color naturally, and guards to keep the neighborhood quiet so he could sleep before big race days. He was also rumored to have a house with furniture, servants, and even dinner guests, some of whom were senators. That's right. There were evenings when actual human politicians sat across from a horse and tried not to get out charmed. Was Caligula serious about the appointment? Probably not. But that's the terrifying part. He may have been mocking the Senate by suggesting a horse could do their job better. Which, depending on the average senator, might have been true. Or maybe it was madness. Caligula's reign is infamous for its chaos. Incest, executions, self-deification, moonlit battles with Neptune. Making a horse a consul fits neatly into a resume that reads like an LSD fever dream set in marble. Either way, Incitatus became a symbol not just of decadence or delusion, but of the absurd flexibility of power. When you can turn a horse into a politician, reality isn't broken. It's yours to rewrite. And speaking of flipping reality upside down, wait until you hear about the Roman holiday where slaves became masters, silly hats were mandatory, and chaos was practically sacred. The ancient Romans celebrated a festival called Saturnalia, where slaves became masters for a day. If Christmas and April Fool's Day had a love child and raised it in a toga, it would be Saturnalia. Every December, Rome threw its most unhinged party of the year, a week-long carnival dedicated to Saturn, the god of agriculture and time. And how did they celebrate? By breaking every social rule in the empire. During Saturnalia, slaves were temporarily freed, allowed to talk back, give orders, and even sit at the head of the table. Masters served them food, not the other way around. Hierarchies were flipped like pancakes on a griddle of anarchy. And everyone wore silly hats, the pileus, a soft, conical cap that screamed, "I'm not responsible for my actions this week." Gambling was legal, debts were forgotten, gifts were exchanged, and the streets of Rome pulsed with laughter, mockery, and probably a lot of wine-based decisions that didn't age well. In essence, it was a controlled riot social inversion as religious observance. But don't get too sentimental. This wasn't a revolution. It was a pressure valve, a week of sanctioned chaos to make the rest of the year tolerable. By letting slaves pretend to be free, the Romans reminded them they weren't. The moment the festival ended, the hats came off, the chains metaphorically, and sometimes literally, went back on, and the world snapped back into brutal order. Still, for that brief time, Saturnalia let Rome laugh at itself. Even emperors played along. Nero gave his guards silly nicknames. Claudius gambled publicly. Caligula, well, he probably tried to marry a hat. The legacy of Saturnalia didn't die with Rome. It morphed into medieval festivals, influenced Christmas, and survives today in every ugly sweater party where office interns dance with their boss. But while Rome had holidays for flipping the social script, the Anglo-Saxons had words for flipping your mood like hangry, centuries before it was a hashtag. Anglo-Saxons used the word hangry, literally hingred, long before it became trendy. Long before millennials claimed it as a personality trait, the Anglo-Saxons had already named the sacred intersection between hunger and rage, gred. The word appears in Old English, meaning wretched, hungry, or miserably hungry. And yes, it's the proto-version of what we now call being hangry. Apparently, medieval peasants didn't need Snickers to know they weren't themselves on an empty stomach. What makes hingred fascinating isn't just its existence, it's that it was considered a legitimate emotional state. Not just a fleeting mood, but a real affliction worthy of poetic lament. In an era where food was scarce, and people didn't eat 3 square meals with oat milk and activated almonds, being hangry was probably a weekly spiritual crisis. The word crops up in literature and religious texts. Saints were hingred in the desert. Sinners were hingred for salvation. Warriors were hingred for glory, and a pork leg. The emotion wasn't always about literal hunger, it was symbolic of longing, of pain, of the kind of emptiness that gnaws at your bones and makes you yell at your spouse for breathing too loud. You can almost imagine a medieval husband grumbling after a day of famine. "Forgive me, Edith, I was hine," and her nodding solemnly, "I understand, my love." I too have shouted at the cows when dinner was late. It's a small reminder that language evolves, but emotion doesn't. We're still the same moody bipeds, snapping at each other when our blood sugar dips, then blaming it on the nearest available excuse. But where Anglo-Saxon peasants got cranky when hungry, Greek philosophers got existential over legumes. Because in Athens, even your salad had a soul. Greek philosopher Diogenes lived in a giant ceramic jar, not a barrel. If Socrates was the wise gadfly of Athens, Diogenes was its sarcastic raccoon. He rejected money, comfort, convention, and instead chose to live inside what many assume was a barrel. But in reality, it wasn't a barrel. It was a giant ceramic storage jar, like something you'd find olives fermenting in, except it had a philosopher in it. Diogenes wasn't just poor. He was aggressively, philosophically poor. He believed in stripping life down to its bare essentials, no possessions, no shame, and absolutely no respect for authority. He lived in that jar by choice, barking at passers-by like a dog, urinating in public, and once even masturbating in the marketplace because, quote, if only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach. That was Diogenes, full-time thinker, part-time street spectacle. He didn't just rebel, he trolled. When Alexander the Great visited him and asked if there was anything he could do for him, Diogenes replied, yes, stand out of my sunlight. Alexander, stunned, allegedly said, if I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. Diogenes probably rolled his eyes and went back to licking his own feet. He carried a lantern in daylight, claiming he was looking for an honest man. Spoiler, he never found one, because that was the point. Diogenes didn't believe in finding virtue, he believed in exposing hypocrisy. Every gesture he made was a philosophical punchline. His life was an insult to comfort. He mocked the academy, Plato, politeness, and anyone who thought clothing meant virtue. He was the ancient prototype of the unbothered guy who lives in a van and tells billionaires to get bent. And while the rest of Greece debated ideals, Diogenes lived his philosophy in a jar, with zero shame and an unmatched commitment to being a problem. But while Diogenes was pushing buttons in Athens, the medieval world was snorting powdered unicorn horn and calling it medicine. In the Middle Ages, people believed that eating a powdered unicorn horn could cure poisoning. Let's get one thing straight. There were no unicorns in the Middle Ages. None. Not even one. And yet, this minor logistical detail didn't stop people from spending absurd fortunes on what they believed was unicorn, horn powder, the miracle cure for poison, plague, epilepsy, and general inconvenience. Royal courts across Europe hoarded unicorn horn in ornate cases. Kings and queens dipped it into their wine to check for toxins. Apothecaries ground it into powders for sale. And entire medical texts cited it as a guaranteed cure-all. Problem was, it wasn't a unicorn horn. It was usually the tusk of a narwhal. Yes, the medieval elite were paying fortunes for oceanic dental work. This was the original placebo effect, gloriously misinformed and wildly profitable. Imagine some shady merchant hawking narwhal tusks in a tavern, whispering, "It came from the forests of the East, guarded by virgins. Also, it wards off curses." Sold. Even the church got in on it. Unicorns were symbolically tied to Christ, pure, elusive, and sacred, which only made the horns seem more powerful. And if you had one, you weren't just safe, you were practically holy. But it wasn't just for poisoning. Some believed unicorn horn could detect lies, protect against witchcraft, or improve virility. Basically, it was the medieval version of a magical vitamin that could do everything. Feeling tired? Rub some horn powder on it? Feeling cursed? Sprinkle it in your soup. Feeling existential dread? That's your problem. The irony is spectacular. In an age that feared the devil, demons, and decay, people put all their hope in powdered fiction, sold in vials, ground from the ocean, and worshipped like divine medicine. But here's the kicker. It worked, sometimes. Because if you think you're protected from poison, and you drink carefully, you might just live long enough to think powdered horn saved you. Of course, not every medieval ruler was obsessed with fake cures. Some were too busy crowning literal corpses just to keep the paperwork flowing. The Byzantine Empire once crowned a corpse as emperor. Sometimes bureaucracy doesn't just outlive reason, it outlives life. In the Byzantine Empire, which already operated like the world's most dramatic soap opera with religious overtones. One emperor managed to create a legal loophole so baffling, it required crowning a dead man to keep the succession legitimate. Here's how it went. A man died. He was supposed to be emperor, but he died before the ceremony. And apparently, you couldn't just skip the coronation. The laws required it. So, in peak Byzantine fashion, they propped up his corpse, dressed him in imperial robes, and placed a crown on his cold, lifeless head. Ceremony complete. Long live the dead king. It wasn't satire, it was protocol. This wasn't just a weird blip, it reflected the Byzantine obsession with formality. In a system where religious rituals and imperial legitimacy were tightly intertwined, skipping a step could trigger civil war. Better to put a crown on a cadaver than risk theological paperwork chaos. And it worked. The coronation counted. The next guy took the throne. The world moved on. But what a moment. Palace courtiers weeping, choirs singing, and a dead body slumped on a throne while someone solemnly announced, "Behold, your emperor. It's Monty Python with incense." This wasn't even their weirdest move. The Byzantines also debated the color of Christ's shoes, waged theological wars over whether bread should be fluffy or flat, and occasionally blinded their political rivals instead of killing them because murder was a sin, but gouging eyes was just policy. So yes, crowning a corpse made perfect sense. Because in Byzantium, death was negotiable, but skipping tradition, that was unthinkable. And speaking of misunderstood traditions, let's clear up what a vomitorium really was before you picture drunken Romans purging between courses. Roman dining rooms had vomitoriums, but not for vomiting. Ah, the vomitorium. That legendary chamber where indulgent Romans supposedly waddled mid-banquet to make room for more flamingo tongues and honey-roasted dormice. You've probably heard the myth-gluttonous elites sticking a feather down their throats between courses like it was a normal part of fine dining. Except, that's not what a vomitorium was. In reality, a vomitorium was an architectural feature. It was a cleverly designed exit corridor in amphitheaters and stadiums, built to spew crowds efficiently, hence the name. The Latin vomere means to discharge, not to hurl up your third helping of fermented fish sauce. But the lie lives on, probably because it feels true. The Romans were famously decadent. Their banquets went on for hours, featuring bizarre delicacies, musical interludes, and enough wine to fuel a philosophical crisis. So the idea of them casually purging mid-feast to reset their appetite just sounds plausible. Blame 19th century Victorians for the mix-up. Always eager to moralize the fall of Rome, they latched onto the vomitorium myth as proof that excessive pleasure inevitably leads to collapse. Because nothing says civilizational doom like tactical regurgitation. Still, it's worth asking if there wasn't a room for puking. Were the Romans really doing it? Maybe. Elite gluttony was real, and historical accounts do mention overindulgence. But whether they purged at the table, behind the curtains, or just quietly slipped into a fountain is anyone's guess. The vomitorium myth survives not because it's true, but because it's a perfect metaphor. A civilization so rich, so bored, so utterly full of itself, it had to expel the excess just to make room for more. But while Romans were allegedly purging delicacies, their ancient neighbors were using beer not as a drink, but as currency. Cheers to that. Ancient Babylonians used beer as currency. Long before Bitcoin and NFTs, before fiat money and central banks, the Babylonians had a simpler economic system. Beer. Cold, frothy, life-sustaining beer. Except, it wasn't just a drink, it was a paycheck. In ancient Mesopotamia, workers, especially those on large construction projects or temple grounds, were often compensated in daily rations of beer. It wasn't a bonus, it was the wage. Your skill level? Measured in liters. Your productivity? Measured in how sudsy your payment was. For many, beer was safer than water. It was boiled, fermented, and less likely to kill you via bacteria. Plus, it came with calories and could dull the existential horror of building ziggurats under a brutal Sunday. Beer wasn't a novelty, it was fundamental. There were laws about it, recipes for it, entire social rituals built around it. The Code of Hammurabi even set penalties for watering down beer or cheating customers. In a world where gods had temples and people had debts, beer was one of the few things keeping society from collapsing into a dehydrated rage. Picture the workplace, a foreman handing out beer jars at the end of the shift, arguments erupting over whose barley blend was stronger, pay raises negotiated in pints. Unions formed not for better hours, but for better head on their brew. Even women brewed it. In fact, female brewers were common and respected. The goddess Ninkasi, patron of beer, even had a hymn dedicated to her that doubled as a recipe. That's right, religion and craft brewing, hand in hand. In a sense, the Babylonians figured out a truth we've been dancing around for centuries. Labor is exhausting, money is boring, and beer is both soothing and quantifiable. Why waste time on coins when you can toast your paycheck? Medieval Europeans believed beavers bit off their own testicles to escape hunters, and this made it into medieval bestiaries. If you ever feel like your survival instincts are underdeveloped, just be glad you weren't a medieval beaver. Because according to the folklore and widely illustrated bestiaries, these adorable dam builders had a secret, grisly escape strategy. When pursued by hunters, they would chew off their own testicles and toss them aside as a distraction. Here, take the goods, just let me live. This legend wasn't a fringe belief. It was a mainstream medieval fact, repeated by monks, scribes, and illustrators with an unsettling lack of skepticism. The beaver, they believed, was hunted primarily for its castoreum, a real substance secreted from glands near the tail, but conveniently misunderstood as the animal's actual testicles. The result? A furry creature that, when faced with danger, allegedly chose DIY neutering over capture. It sounds like a twisted cartoon gag, but in medieval Europe, it was treated as a moral fable. The beaver, by sacrificing its reproductive capacity, symbolized the ideal Christian penitent, someone willing to cast away sin, or, in this case, their manhood, to escape the devil. You weren't just reading about wildlife. You were reading a sermon in fur. Illustrated bestiaries show the beaver mid-act, often mid-stride, smiling as it flings its testicles at a wide-eyed hunter. The drawings are hilariously literal, as if the artists had never actually seen a beaver, but had heard just enough gossip to confidently depict it in testicular flight. And the wildest part? This wasn't some one-off myth. It endured for centuries. Naturalists copied it. Preachers cited it. Generations of readers accepted that, somewhere in the woods, beavers were dismembering themselves in noble resignation. Of course, none of it is true. Beavers do not bite off their testicles, nor would it even help if they did. But logic and biology had no place in the medieval imagination, not when a talking lion or suicidal squirrel could teach you a good moral lesson. It's a window into a time when animals weren't just animals. They were moral metaphors in motion, each one doing its part to remind humans to behave or face divine judgment with teeth. And speaking of wild natural remedies, wait until you hear what the ancient Greeks used as birth control. Spoiler, it involved crocodile dung. Ancient Greeks used crocodile dung as contraception. Yes, you read that correctly. The same civilization that gave us democracy, drama, and philosophy also gave us reptilian birth control. In ancient Greece and Egypt, to be fair, people used crocodile dung as a contraceptive. Specifically, it was inserted. That's right, into the body, as a barrier. Because nothing says romance like the smell of swampy danger packed where the sun doesn't shine. The idea, as horrifying as it sounds, was actually rooted in some halfway reasonable ancient science. The dung, once dried, could form a kind of plug, and the high alkalinity might have acted as a mild spermicide. But let's not pretend this was medical wisdom. It was guesswork. Desperate, squishy, smell-intensive guesswork. This was before latex, before pills, before people even agreed on how babies were made. So, folks turned to nature, and nature, to them, looked like a crocodile having a bad day. Imagine the preparation. You've set the mood, your oil lamps are flickering, and your partner excuses themselves to fetch a scoop of yesterday's Nile nugget. That's love, ancient style. And it wasn't just crocodile dung. Other substances included honey, acacia leaves, and disturbingly bread soaked in wine and shoved in like a carb-loaded sponge. But the crocodile bit stuck around in the historical imagination, probably because it's the most viscerally unpleasant image possible. The real miracle isn't that people tried it, it's that anyone got pregnant at all with these methods. Which raises a bigger point. Humans will go to astonishing lengths to avoid responsibility for other humans, even if it means involving aggressive swamp lizards in the reproductive process. But if you think that's bizarre, it's still only bodily. The legal system in medieval France took things to an entirely different level of strange when animals weren't just moral lessons, they were actual defendants. You're absolutely right, and thank you for catching that. I mistakenly skipped over the correct version of the animal trial fact, which includes the essential detail. Pigs were frequent offenders. Let's fix that now with a fresh, complete rewrite of the correct segment, strictly adhering to your structure and minimum length requirement. In early medieval France, animals were sometimes put on trial, complete with legal representation. Pigs were frequent offenders. In early medieval France, the law was simple. If you committed a crime, you were put on trial. And that rule applied to everyone: peasants, nobles, monks, and pigs. Yes, especially pigs. Because if a pig killed someone, the courts didn't just butcher it and move on. They summoned it. Officially. Publicly. With a lawyer. It wasn't satire. It was justice. You'd get an actual trial. Witnesses, testimonies, legal arguments, sometimes even a judge in full ecclesiastical robes gravely pronouncing verdicts over a sow who had trampled a child. In one infamous case, the pig was even dressed in human clothes before being publicly executed, as if humiliating it made the legal process more civilized. The logic, warped as it was, followed a kind of internal consistency. In a world where sin and punishment governed all, animals were seen as moral agents capable of wrongdoing. A pig that gored a farmer wasn't just dangerous, it was guilty. It had committed a moral breach. It had to answer for its crimes. So, pigs being common, semi-domesticated, and notoriously bitey became frequent offenders. Chickens, goats, and horses had their moments too. But the pig reigned supreme in the medieval courtroom, a waddling symbol of rural chaos and criminal impulse. And don't think these trials were done quietly. No, they were public spectacles. People gathered to watch justice be served. Punishments included hanging, beheading, or burning, executed with the same solemnity reserved for human criminals. Sometimes, entire herds were excommunicated. You haven't seen religious zealotry until you've seen a bishop formally damn a bunch of cows. It sounds absurd because it is, but it wasn't just about the pig. These trials reaffirmed social order, divine authority, and the illusion of control in a world constantly falling apart from war, famine, and disease. When a pig was punished, people felt safer. Not because the threat was gone, but because the rules still worked. It's legal theater at its most surreal, equal parts morality play, judicial fantasy, and existential coping mechanism. So yes, pigs had lawyers, pigs were hanged, and somewhere in the archives of French ecclesiastical law sits the memory of a particularly unruly hog who went down squealing guilty, but well represented. Now then, back to history's first vending machine and beyond. The first vending machine was invented in ancient Egypt. Long before Coke machines beeped angrily at wrinkled bills, the ancient Egyptians figured out how to automate sacred transactions. Meet the first known vending machine, a device that dispensed holy water at temples. Yes, holy water, available on demand via divine slot technology. Invented by Hero of Alexandria, a man with a name so fitting it hurts, this ancient vending machine worked like this. You inserted a coin into a slot, which triggered a hidden lever, allowing a set amount of holy water to pour out. Once the coin hit a stopper, the flow ceased. Transaction complete. Bless you, and enjoy your day. This wasn't a back alley gadget, it was installed in temples. It was essentially a theological paywall. No coin, no sacred hydration. What's wild is how deeply this disrupts our mental image of the ancient world. We think of it as primitive torches and robes and prayer beads. But here's evidence of a mechanical, coin-operated system running thousands of years before modern capitalism. A spiritual vending machine designed to regulate faith and fluid with engineering precision. Why the system? Because humans, being humans, were taking too much holy water, dipping a jug in the basin, walking off like it was Costco sample day. So the priests did what all good institutions eventually do, monetized control. Hero, the genius behind the design, was a prolific inventor. He also developed automatic doors and steam-powered contraptions. The man was a walking anachronism, but the vending machine? That one hit different. It wasn't about fun, it was about faith on a timer. Imagine being a peasant, shuffling into a temple with your last coin, praying for rain or healing, and watching as a machine whirs and delivers just enough. A miracle brought to you by rudimentary hydraulics. And if that level of engineered absurdity surprises you, wait until we get to the next Roman fashion trend: eyebrows made of rodent fur. Roman women used mouse fur as fake eyebrows. The Romans had many talents: war, roads, law, and apparently eyebrow-based taxidermy. In a society obsessed with aesthetics, Roman women would go to great lengths to maintain a flawless look. Pale skin, fashionable. Elaborate hairstyles, expected. And thick, dramatic eyebrows, non-negotiable. So what happened when your brows didn't cooperate? You glued on mouse fur. Yes, mouse fur, as in small, dead rodents, shaved, shaped, and attached to the forehead using resin or tree sap. A trend equal parts beauty routine and horror film subplot. This wasn't a joke. It was fashion. Eyebrows were symbols of status, youth, and sensuality. To walk around with bare brows was a statement of illness, of shame, of general eyebrow bankruptcy. But instead of drawing them on, an option the Egyptians had mastered centuries earlier, the Romans went full taxidermy. And this wasn't just for the elite. Even middle-class women reportedly partook, crafting their brow wigs at home, probably muttering things like, "No one will know," while scraping mouse scraps into a neat arch. The end result? Bold, fuzzy, surprisingly expressive eyebrow structures that could turn sweaty mid-feast and start peeling off during conversation. Imagine locking eyes with someone across the triclinium, and their left brow slides down their cheek like a defeated caterpillar. But don't judge too harshly. Today's false lashes and contour kits aren't so different. Beauty has always been a game of illusion, though perhaps with less rodent involvement. What's most fascinating is the level of commitment. In a world where hygiene was inconsistent and mirrors were bronze, women still labored for the perfect brow. Not for practicality, not for survival, but for art, for beauty, for the Roman version of Instagram ready. So the next time you're plucking, shaving, or penciling, remember the mouse, that tiny martyr of Roman fashion, because nothing says empire like conquering both continents and follicles one rodent at a time. And speaking of strange but surprisingly stylish innovations, The Egyptians weren't done yet. They also invented the world's oldest known prosthetic, and it was a toe, a fabulous toe. The oldest known prosthetic body part is an Egyptian wooden toe. It wasn't a war medal. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't even decorative. It was a functional, wearable wooden toe strapped to the foot of an ancient Egyptian woman who, 3,000 years ago, decided she wasn't going to let something as mundane as amputation stop her from living stylishly. The toe wasn't some lump of carved wood. It was articulated, designed to move, and shaped with care. Leather straps held it in place. The craftsmanship was delicate, and, more importantly, it worked. Evidence suggests the wearer used it daily. In other words, this wasn't a ceremonial piece. This was orthopedic fashion at its finest. And let's pause here to appreciate the timeline. This happened more than 2,000 years before the invention of modern prosthetics, before titanium joints, before carbon fiber blades, before anyone had even figured out the germ theory of disease. But this woman had a custom toe that allowed her to walk properly in sandals because, of course, the ancient Egyptians had to invent stylish mobility first. They weren't strangers to body modification either. Dentures, surgical tools, even fake eyes if something could be lost, the Egyptians would figure out a way to sculpt, paint, or bind a replacement. Death wasn't the end. Losing a toe certainly wasn't. What's more, the toe was likely a social necessity. Sandals were standard, and having a visible deformity could mean losing status. This was a culture that mummified bodies so the dead would look good in the afterlife. Of course, they cared about toe aesthetics. And yet, behind all the gold, mummies, and pyramids, we get this one deeply human moment. A woman in pain, wanting to walk with dignity, and someone else, likely a craftsman, working carefully to help her do that. It's ancient technology meeting, ancient vanity, colliding in a wooden toe that worked hard and looked good doing it. Meanwhile, not everyone in history believed in keeping things clean. In fact, some early Christian monks took cleanliness as a kind of moral failure. Early Christian monks considered bathing to be a vanity. In the deserts and monasteries of early Christianity, cleanliness was not next to godliness, it was next to arrogance. Bathing, these monks believed, was a sign of pride, vanity, and an unholy attachment to the flesh, and so they stopped doing it. Like, really stopped. Some of the most revered saints and ascetics bragged about how long they went without touching water. Decades, in some cases. Their skin cracked. Their robes rotted into their bodies. They stank. Flies circled, but none of it mattered, because they believed that filth brought them closer to spiritual purity. Washing was for the world. Cleanliness, they thought, led to temptation. A freshly bathed body might make you think too highly of yourself, or worse, tempt someone else to notice you. The logic was simple. If your presence clears out a room faster than a plague, you're less likely to fall into sin. This wasn't laziness. It was discipline. Dirt was proof of devotion. Some monasteries even had rules limiting or forbidding bathing entirely. And if you had to wash, say, after bleeding or touching something ritually unclean, it was to be done quickly, with as little enjoyment as possible. Joyful washing was suspect. And here's the thing, it worked, at least in their eyes. These monks became local legends. The stinkier and more shriveled they became, the holier they were considered. Pilgrims would visit them, kiss their sores, collect their sweat-stained robes as relics. God was believed to favor the foul. One famous saint refused to bathe or change clothes for 50 years. Another lived on top of a pillar and never descended, not even to rinse off. Heaven, he thought, was upward. Baths were for the earthbound. This wasn't just self-denial. It was a protest against Roman decadence, against bodily vanity, against the very idea that the human form deserved comfort. The body was a sack of sin. Better to let it rot slowly in devotion than risk polishing it like a trophy. Still, while monks were trying to smell their way into heaven, one Viking warrior was out there beating entire castles solo and walking away like it was just another Tuesday. A Viking warrior once challenged an entire castle to fight him one by one and won. He didn't come with an army, he didn't launch a siege, he didn't even knock. This unnamed Viking warrior stood at the gates of a fortified castle, declared himself unimpressed, and challenged the entire garrison to fight him one by one. And they accepted. One after another the defenders came out, and one after another he defeated them all. This wasn't a drunken bar brawl, it was a formal challenge. Like a real-life boss battle, except the boss was outside the castle and winning. The accounts don't tell us much about his name, his reasons, or how many opponents he fought. All we know is that he arrived, stacked the bodies, and left. No siege, no looting, no follow-up. He just wanted to prove a point. And that point was, I can take you all, solo. This is Viking culture in its purest form, the cult of individual prowess. While their armies were feared, what the Norse really loved were lone heroes, larger-than-life figures who didn't just win battles, they performed feats. Outnumbered? Good. Underdog? Even better. Covered in blood and insults? Perfect. What's most fascinating is that this story wasn't recorded as an act of madness. It was a legend of honor, a tale told to children as inspiration. The ultimate flex, being so confident in your skill that you see a castle and say, let's do this politely, one at a time. And the defenders? They respected it, enough to play by his rules. They didn't rush him, mob him, or laugh him off, because somewhere inside, they understood. This was ritual, a test, a demonstration of will, strength, and supreme Viking audacity. Then, like a mythological mic drop, the warrior vanished into the fog, bloody, victorious, and completely uninterested in sticking around for a thank you dinner. If you think that's strange, wait until you hear about the people who literally got paid to fart professionally. Yes, that was a job. In ancient China, flatulence was once considered a paid profession. Some people are born entertainers. Others are born emission specialists. In ancient China, if you had a particularly musical backside and no shame, you could make a living as a professional farter. Not a joke, not a street insult, a literal job. These individuals were hired, trained, and occasionally celebrated for their ability to produce controlled, on-demand flatulence for the amusement of nobles. Yes, there was a moment in history where someone's career path started with, well, he's got a real talent for timing and tone, and ended with roaring laughter from silk-robed aristocrats. These professionals weren't just blasting wind willy-nilly. There was technique, rhythm, structure. Some were said to imitate instruments. Others could fart in sequences or even in harmony with flutes or string instruments. Imagine an evening gala, fine porcelain, delicate tea, and a man in the center of the room letting out melodic squeaks to a beat. Culture. And this wasn't isolated weirdness. Flatulence humor has existed in nearly every human society. But to take it to the level of state-sanctioned performance art, that's ancient China's contribution to history. It also says something about the society itself. In the midst of imperial order, poetry, calligraphy, and strict Confucian hierarchy, there was paid room for people who mastered the lowest form of comedy. Literally. Some emperors, it's said, kept these men around for stress relief. Political tension? Cue the court farter. Royal guests too uptight? Let's break the ice with a solo performance in B-flat. You can almost hear the sound of a lute stopping mid-song as the real star enters. Of course, not all entertainers wore silk robes, and some worked in back rooms, counting days, watching stars, and trying to fix the calendar that the Romans had somehow broken beyond belief. The Roman calendar was once so broken that Julius Caesar had to add 90 extra days to fix it. By the time Julius Caesar got around to overhauling the Roman calendar, time itself had become a mess. Festivals were off, harvests were mistimed, priests were manipulating the months for political gain. Rome's sense of time was so misaligned with the actual solar year that winter was showing up in autumn, or not showing up at all. Enter Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, slayer of the Republic, and now calendar repairman. He called in the Alexandrian astronomer Sosigenes and asked, essentially, "Can you fix this?" The result was the Julian calendar, a system so robust it would last over 1,600 years with only minor tweaks. But the road to fixing it? That was pure chaos. To get Rome back on track, Caesar had to insert 90 extra days into one calendar year. That meant 445 days of official time. Imagine living through a year that just wouldn't end. You've survived spring, summer, fall, and then surprise. You've got 3 more months of February. People didn't know what day it was. Festivals popped up with no warning. Farmers planted in confusion. Political campaigns dragged on. The Senate grumbled. But Caesar was determined to get Rome synchronized with the sun, even if he had to bulldoze time itself. It worked. The Julian calendar redefined the way the empire, and eventually, most of the Western world kept time. Leap years were introduced. Months were standardized. And Caesar, never one to shy away from a branding opportunity, made sure July was named after himself. Still, it's telling that Rome, a civilization obsessed with order and control, let its calendar slip so far out of whack that the only solution was to add a whole season like it was an app update. And speaking of updates, Rome wasn't the only place with strange laws. Over in Anglo-Saxon England, the bees were unionized, armed, and legally protected. In Anglo-Saxon England, there was a law against stealing bees, and if they stung you, it was considered legal self-defense. It's the 10th century. You've got a neighbor with a thriving hive, sweet golden honey dripping from the combs, tempting. So you reach over the fence, grab a swarm, and boom, you've committed a felony. In Anglo-Saxon England, bees weren't just buzzing background noise. They were valuable property. Honey wasn't just dessert, it was currency, medicine, and most importantly, the base ingredient in mead, which, to a medieval Englishman, was basically liquid happiness. So yes, bees were protected by law. Stealing them was theft. Not petty theft serious, fine-worthy, potentially exile-inducing theft. Bees were livestock with wings, and their owners were not messing around. But it gets better. If a stolen bee stung you, too bad. That was considered self-defense. The bee was legally in the right. You were trespassing. You were stealing. You got what you deserved, one itchy welt at a time. And that's not even the weirdest part. There were procedures for tracking stolen swarms. If a hive went missing, a beekeeper could follow it across properties. If found, there might be a legal hearing. Witnesses, compensation, possibly even a trial. For bees, some laws even dictated the proper care of hives. Mistreating your bees? Also punishable. Because a happy bee makes more honey, and more honey makes more mead. And more mead means fewer peasants questioning feudalism. The Anglo-Saxons weren't sentimental, they were practical. Bees were worth money, and anything worth money had rules. Even if it had 6 legs, wings, and a habit of flying directly into your ale mug. This wasn't just about honey, it was about order. Every sting, every swarm, every stolen queen had legal weight. And in a world of chaos, disease, and Viking raids, at least the bees were regulated. But not every philosophical dilemma could be solved by swatting insects. Some thinkers in ancient Greece, for instance, had a bigger question. Do beans have souls? Ancient Greek philosophers debated whether beans had souls. Beans. Humble, protein-packed, fart-inducing beans. Harmless, right? Not in ancient Greece. To some philosophers, especially Pythagoras and his followers, beans were spiritually dangerous. Like, avoid at all costs, dangerous. Not because of indigestion, but because they were thought to be mystically linked to the soul. Eat a bean, and you might just be committing a low-level act of cannibalism, gassy cannibalism. Pythagoras, best known for his math, and less known for his strict food laws, forbade his followers from touching, growing, or even looking at beans too fondly. To him, they weren't just legumes, they were potential vessels of reincarnation. In other words, that lentil stew might contain grandma. Some ancient texts claimed that beans had connections to the underworld. Their hollow stems were believed to offer passage for souls. Others said beans sprouted without noticeable scars from their seeds, symbolizing unnatural growth. Still, others just thought they smelled like sin. Whatever the reason, beans were out. A forbidden food group, the tofu of the damned. The level of seriousness is staggering. Pythagoreans were said to refuse crossing bean fields, even during emergencies. One story suggests that a group of them, fleeing attackers, came upon a bean field and chose death over desecration. That's devotion. That's also a dietary restriction taken way too far. But let's not pretend it was just beans. Ancient thinkers were obsessed with moralizing food. What you ate, they believed, shaped who you were. Beans? Too earthy, too impure, too mysterious. You never really knew what was going on inside them. Suspicious little pods. This wasn't mainstream Greek philosophy. Most people didn't care. They ate beans, digested them, and carried on. But the Pythagorean fear of legumes lives on as one of history's weirdest examples of intellectual overreach. Imagine being remembered for geometry and a lifelong vendetta against chili. But while some men feared beans, others feared something far more lethal, poison. And one paranoid king decided to eat only with golden forks, just in case. Theodoric the Great feared being poisoned so much, he only ate with golden forks. You're a king. You've crushed your enemies, inherited an empire, and now rule over the ruins of Rome. So what's left to fear? Apparently, cutlery. Theodoric, the great Ostrogothic king, ruler of Italy, and general bringer of post-Roman order, was so terrified of being poisoned that he refused to eat with anything but gold utensils. Not because they were stylish, although they definitely were, but because gold doesn't corrode. No rust, no chemical reactions, no sneaky toxins from a jealous cousin laced into a tarnished knife. In a world where assassination via food was practically a sport, this wasn't entirely irrational. Political rivals had a habit of slipping fatal surprises into soup. And in an age where science and superstition were best friends, people truly believed certain metals could leach out poison or even be poison themselves. So Theodoric stuck with gold, all the time. Forks, knives, plates, maybe even napkin rings. Meals at his court must have looked like a dragon's hoard laid out for brunch. But hey, if it made him feel safer, why not eat your grapes off a treasure pile? Of course, it didn't stop there. Theodoric also employed food tasters, cupbearers, and possibly secret testers who monitored everything he consumed. And if anyone in the room coughed after dinner, paranoia, maybe even executions. The irony? He still died in fear. According to legend, his paranoia became a prison. One tale even claims he hallucinated the ghost of a man he'd unjustly executed, rising from a fish platter. Theodoric ran from the room, shouting, tormented by the very meal he'd tried so hard to control. In the end, golden forks may have looked impressive, but they couldn't protect him from guilt or ghosts. And while gold was keeping kings alive, over in the Americas, another empire was using something far tastier for commerce: chocolate. The Maya used chocolate as currency. Before chocolate was comfort food, it was cold, bitter, and financially binding. The ancient Maya didn't just drink chocolate, they used it as money, actual currency. You could buy food, pay taxes, even settle debts using cacao beans. It was the original edible economy. And yes, people did sometimes steal, counterfeit, and fake their chocolate money. This wasn't sweet Swiss confectionery. This was spicy, gritty, unsweetened liquid bitterness, often served foamy and hot. The Maya spiced it with chili, maize, and even blood. It wasn't a treat, it was sacred, symbolic, and sophisticated. To drink cacao was to connect with the gods. To possess it was to hold power. Rulers stockpiled it like gold. Farmers grew it with reverence. And the average market had cacao beans flowing through it like nickels through a Vegas slot machine. Imagine being a Maya merchant, counting out beans, blowing stray bits of shell off your tax payment, and arguing with a seller about the freshness of your currency. And yes, cacao fraud was real. People hollowed out beans and stuffed them with dirt. Others carved lookalikes from clay. There was even suspicion that some clever folks tried to paint rocks brown and pass them off as legit. It worked because cacao wasn't just consumable, it was countable. It could be stored, measured, and exchanged. And it came with a cultural and religious weight that made it universally respected. Chocolate wasn't just a drink, it was divine economics. And unlike gold or silver, you could eat it in a pinch. Starving? Break open your savings account and boil it. In a way, it was the ultimate emergency fund. So, next time you pay $6 for a mocha, remember, you're reenacting the sacred rituals of an ancient civilization, badly, with whipped cream. And while the Maya drank their wealth, back in Rome, one emperor was having a change of heart about bodily functions, specifically the socially awkward art of flatulence. Roman Emperor Claudius banned flatulence in public, then changed his mind. In the long scroll of Roman law, you'll find decrees about war, taxes, and civil rights, and then, tucked somewhere in the margins, a ruling on farting. Specifically, Emperor Claudius once issued an imperial ban on public flatulence, only to later rescind it on the grounds that holding it in might be unhealthy. Because even in the Roman Empire, digestive dignity had limits. Claudius, often mocked for his stammer and limp, was actually a shrewd ruler, but he was also a bit of an oddball. Obsessed with trivia, he wrote entire volumes on dice games and the Etruscan language, and, clearly, he had opinions about bodily etiquette. At some point in his reign, someone possibly in court, possibly at a banquet let loose, a poorly timed puff, and Claudius thought, this must be stopped. So came the ban. No more public emissions. Rome had toilets but apparently lacked boundaries, and Claudius wanted to bring a bit of decorum to the city that invented shared sponges. But then came the pivot. Maybe he read some obscure medical scroll. Maybe he let one slip during a Senate meeting and decided to save face. Whatever the reason, he reversed the law, reportedly declaring that suppressing wind was dangerous to health, and therefore, public farting should be allowed. Just imagine it, Claudius. Imperial robes rustling, solemnly addressing the Senate on the matter of flatulence. An entire empire watching its leader legislate gas like it was foreign policy. The deeper irony? This wasn't even controversial. Rome had always had a weirdly casual relationship with bodily functions. Communal toilets, open baths, gods of sewage, it was a culture that lived close to the human machine. And so, flatulence was legalized in public. A moment of imperial grace, or at least intestinal mercy. Claudius may not be remembered for conquest or revolution, but he left his mark through policy and passing wind. Meanwhile, across the world, a very different empire was turning people into chess pieces, literally. In ancient India, chess was originally played with real people on life-size boards by kings. Before it was a quiet game played by nerds and grandmasters, chess was a blood-soaked spectacle, at least in ancient India, where the earliest versions of the game were not symbolic but literal, and sometimes involved actual people standing in for pieces on life-sized boards. Imagine it, a giant courtyard gridded like a chessboard, and instead of carved knights and pawns, you had living humans moving square by square, directed by a king with a god complex and way too much time on his hands. Sometimes the pieces were soldiers, sometimes they were prisoners, and sometimes, depending on how bloodthirsty the monarch was, losers didn't walk off the board. They were executed on the spot. It was part pageantry, part punishment, and part high-stakes theater. These games blurred the line between strategy and state-sanctioned performance art. Because what's a better show of power than turning a game into a battlefield with real consequences? This early form of chess, called chaturanga, was a war simulation, infantry, cavalry, elephants, and chariots, replacing today's pawns, knights, bishops, and rooks. It wasn't just recreation, it was training, ritual, and spectacle rolled into one. And what better way to underscore the king's command than by moving human beings like pawns in a giant sandbox of ego? To be clear, not every game ended in blood. Some were ceremonial, others theatrical. But the message was consistent: you are disposable, and I am the player. It's the origin story of chess that no one teaches kids at school, the one where losing the game meant you didn't just lose your dignity, you lost your head. Eventually, the game became abstract, symbolic, sanitized, but its roots remain sharp, hierarchical, and disturbingly real. And if you think that's dark, wait until we talk medieval maps, because people once believed the world was filled with dragons, unicorns, and men with literal dog heads. Some medieval maps included dragons, unicorns, and people with dog heads, and no one batted an eye. Before GPS, satellite imaging, and Google Earth, maps were less about geography and more about existential dread. Enter the medieval Mappa Mundi, a glorious, inaccurate mess of oceans, empires, and things that definitely never existed, like unicorns, dragons, and entire tribes of dog-headed men. Yes, dog-headed men known as cynocephaly were believed by some medieval scholars to inhabit distant, unexplored lands. According to the best minds of the 13th century, if you sailed far enough past the edge of civilization, you'd eventually run into a society of polite, clothed, upright canines who could speak in barks and sometimes practice Christianity. Some were even considered semi-saints. And then there were the dragons, long coiled serpents drawn beside coastlines, often captioned, "Here be dragons," the historical equivalent of, "Don't go here unless you want to get flambéed by myth." Add in unicorns, monopods, men with one giant foot, and blemier, people with faces in their chests, and you had maps that looked more like a Dungeons and Dragons campaign than a navigation tool. But no one batted an eye, because medieval maps weren't designed for accuracy. They were spiritual and symbolic. Geography was filtered through theology, legend, and pure anxiety about what lived beyond the next hill. If it wasn't known, it was feared. If it was feared, it was drawn, with flourishes. These maps weren't just for explorers. They were worldviews. They reinforced the centrality of Christendom, the dangers of the other, and the thin veil between reality and legend. They were art, propaganda, and theological infographics all at once. So when you looked at a medieval map, you weren't seeing the earth, you were seeing the medieval psyche, half curiosity, half horror. Today, we laugh at the inaccuracies, but deep down, we're still drawing mental maps full of monsters, just in higher resolution. And speaking of over-the-top architectural flourishes, wait until you hear about the emperor who built a dining room that rotated while guests ate, powered by slaves, of course. Nero built a rotating dining room, powered by slaves to give guests a new view with every course. Leave it to Nero, Rome's most infamously dramatic emperor, to look at a dinner party and think, this isn't decadent enough. Let's make the entire room spin. Yes, according to ancient accounts, Nero commissioned a rotating dining room in his golden house, Domus Aurea, an absurdly lavish palace built in the smoldering footprint of the Great Fire of Rome. Because nothing says, I care about the people, like constructing a gold-plated funhouse on their ashes. The dining room allegedly turned slowly, mimicking the motion of the heavens, so that guests could admire a changing view of the sky, gardens, or inner decor with each course. Very immersive. Very divine, very dizzying. Picture sipping wine, trying to appear composed while your marble surroundings are gliding like a lazy Ferris wheel. And how was this mechanical miracle powered? Slaves. Human laborers were tucked beneath the room, turning enormous mechanisms by hand to keep the rotation going. So, while the senators above nibbled peacock tongues and argued over poetry, exhausted workers below likely prayed the vomitoriums weren't used too enthusiastically that evening. This wasn't just about luxury, it was cosmic theater. Nero styled himself as a living god, and his dining room was built to reflect that. The rotation symbolized his control over the universe. His guests weren't just eating, they were participating in an imperial illusion of eternity. But also, it was Nero, the man who allegedly sang while Rome burned, who married a eunuch and declared him empress, who had a mother killed for being too controlling, and who once competed in the Olympics and awarded himself the victory. The rotating room wasn't a surprise, it was the logical conclusion of a man whose appetite for spectacle had no off switch. And yet, despite the cruelty behind the curtain, the legend of the rotating dining room survives as a perfect metaphor for Nero himself, dazzling on the outside, horrifying underneath. And speaking of horrifying misunderstandings of basic science, medieval Europeans had a lot of questions about cheese. Medieval Europeans believed cheese was formed by milk battling itself inside the stomach. Modern science explains cheese as a fermentation process involving enzymes, bacteria, and lots of patiently curdled dairy. But medieval Europeans had a better idea. Cheese happened when milk went to war with itself inside the stomach. Seriously, that was the belief. Milk, once swallowed, began a kind of internal civil war, its good parts separating from its bad parts through struggle and conflict. The result? Curds and whey. And eventually, cheese, a product of dairy combat. This theory came from a mix of Greek medical ideas, rudimentary observation, and a general medieval tendency to explain everything in terms of moral conflict. The body, they believed, wasn't just meat and bone, it was a battleground for cosmic and elemental forces. So if your food turned into something new inside you, it had to be fighting first. And milk, as it turns out, was deeply suspicious. It could nourish, but it could also spoil. It was white and pure, but also weirdly unstable. So of course it made sense that it was constantly betraying itself in your belly like a lactose Caesar. This was not just a fringe belief. It showed up in early medical texts and dietary advice. Physicians debated which cheeses were morally stronger, whether cows produced more peaceful curds than goats, and if stomachs could be too weak to handle dairy warfare. It was science, with a splash of theology and a lot of guessing. Also, keep in mind, people in the Middle Ages loved cheese. They made it, traded it, hoarded it. Monks in particular became expert cheesemakers, possibly because they had time to reflect on the theological implications of every gurgling batch. Was this wheel the result of divine harmony, or a sign that Brother Thomas needed to lay off the goat milk? In a way, the belief was kind of poetic, a tiny battle playing out inside you, giving birth to something nourishing. Medieval metaphysics meets snack time. And if you think throwing milk into a metaphorical arena is weird, Wait until you hear what the Irish did when it was time to crown their kings. Bring out the sacred shoe. The Irish once crowned kings with a ceremonial shoe and sometimes threw it at them. Forget scepters, crowns, and thrones. In ancient and medieval Ireland, the road to kingship sometimes involved a shoe not as footwear, but as sacred regalia, and occasionally as a projectile. The coronation ceremony in certain regions featured the new king being presented with a single shoe, often ornate or symbolic. In some traditions, he would stand on a sacred stone with one foot bare and the other inside the ceremonial shoe. This wasn't a fashion statement. It was a ritual, packed with meaning. The bare foot grounded the king to the land. The shoed foot symbolized authority, readiness, or possibly divine appointment. The act tied the monarch to the earth and people he ruled. Because nothing says legitimacy like standing awkwardly in public with mismatched footwear. And then there's the shoe throwing. In some accounts, during or after the crowning, a member of the clan or an opposing family might throw a shoe at the new ruler as part of the ritual. Was it symbolic protest? A test of humility? Or just a good old-fashioned warning shot? Historians aren't sure. But if your first act as king is ducking a flying loafer, that sets the tone. This wasn't a joke ceremony. It was ancient, powerful, tied to land ownership, clan lineage, and mystical rite. Kingship wasn't just inherited, it was performed, with rituals deeply embedded in soil, superstition, and footwear. One of the most famous shoe stones is the Leophile on the hill of Tara. Legend said that when the rightful king stood upon it, the stone would roar in approval. Now imagine doing that while getting beamed in the head with a sandal. Majesty is complicated. These rituals highlight the uniquely Irish blend of myth, politics, and practicality. Your bloodline mattered. Your land mattered. But your balance, apparently, mattered too. And speaking of balancing acts, Roman priests once had the sacred task of interpreting the divine not through scripture or dreams, but by watching birds poop. Ancient Roman priests, known as augurs, interpreted the will of the gods by watching birds fly or poop. In the Roman Republic, if you wanted to start a war, pass a law, or even leave your house on an important day, you didn't ask your generals, senators, or spouse. You asked the birds. Or, more precisely, you asked an augur, a state-sanctioned priest whose job was to interpret divine approval through avian behavior. And yes, sometimes that behavior included pooping. Augurs didn't just toss breadcrumbs and see which way the wind blew. They followed detailed rituals. There were designated auspicious zones in the sky called templum, and the direction a bird flew, its species, the number of birds, the sound it made, and yes, whether it relieved itself were all part of the divine message. The gods, apparently, communicated in wing flaps and bowel movements. If the birds flew in the wrong direction, cancel the battle. If they chirped too much, delay the vote. If they pooped at the wrong moment, the entire ceremony might be considered cursed. Divine messaging was not subtle. It was, quite literally, for the birds. And this wasn't fringe superstition. Augury was institutional. The augurs were a powerful priestly college, consulted on everything from temple construction to senatorial decisions. Even emperors had to pretend to care what the birds thought. It was like having a weather channel crossed with a theology degree, and everyone treated it with complete seriousness. Of course, some augurs were likely faking it. If the political winds weren't blowing the way you wanted, all it took was a conveniently interpreted squawk to declare, "The gods disapprove." It was politics disguised as poultry. And if you think divine bird poop is weird, wait until you hear about the Welsh king who outlawed sneezing in his presence on pain of property loss. In the 6th century, a Welsh king made it illegal to sneeze in his presence, punishable by loss of property. Imagine you're in a royal court in 6th century Wales. You're doing your best to look respectful, bowing low, not making eye contact, and then, it happens. You sneeze. Maybe it's hay fever. Maybe it's nerves. But congratulations, your house now belongs to the king. According to Welsh legend, King Gruffydd ap Cynan was so averse to sneezing near his royal person that he made it a punishable offense. The fine? Loss of property. Land, livestock, maybe even your favorite goat all gone because your nose rebelled in the presence of majesty. The logic behind the law? Possibly a mixture of superstition, control, and royal ego. In many ancient cultures, sneezing was spiritually significant. It could signal divine messages, impending doom, or possession. So when someone exploded snot near the king, it wasn't just gross, it was cosmically disrespectful. But Gruffydd didn't just fume and forgive. He issued legal codes, formal documents that spelled out, in cold medieval prose, that your hay fever moment could cost you your inheritance. That's not law, that's petty revenge set to parchment. And people obeyed, or tried to. Court life became a silent, tense affair, with nobles stifling sneezes like their lives depended on it. Someone probably invented the world's first quiet sneeze technique right there in the king's hall. It's easy to laugh now, but this wasn't an isolated case of bizarre royal tyranny. Medieval kings often inserted their personal quirks into law. Some banned shoes that squeaked. Others outlawed being taller than them. Gruffydd just had a thing about sneezes and the power to make it everyone's problem. So the next time you feel a tickle in your nose, be grateful. You live in a world where sneezing near royalty no longer results in eviction. And yet, while sneezes could cost you your house in Wales, across the sea, Viking women were rewriting divorce law one nightgown at a time. Viking women could divorce their husbands if they wore feminine clothing or were too unmanly in bed. When you picture Viking justice, you probably imagine axes, ships, and mead-fueled duels, not marriage contracts and wardrobe judgments. But make no mistake, Viking women had rights, and they knew how to use them. In Norse law, women could initiate divorce, a right not commonly granted in much of medieval Europe, and the reasons didn't need to involve betrayal or violence. No, in some cases, all it took was a husband being too soft in bed, or wait for it wearing women's clothing. That's right. If a Viking husband donned a dress or acted in a way considered unmanly, his wife had grounds to end the marriage. This wasn't just about fabric. It was about honor, masculinity, and the sacred performance of gender. The Vikings were brutal people with very specific standards. One saga tells of a woman who publicly shamed her husband for lacking aggression in bed, accusing him of being passive and more woman than man. Her community didn't punish her for saying it, they agreed. Viking society valued strength, decisiveness, and virility. A husband who didn't display these traits? Refund, please. And the clothing clause wasn't about fashion, it was symbolic. In Viking culture, gender roles were deeply codified. Cross-dressing wasn't just eccentric, it was dishonorable. A woman could demand a divorce if her man wore effeminate clothes, because it suggested a broader failure to uphold the ideals of Norse masculinity. Of course, women weren't entirely free. Patriarchy was still very much alive. But compared to their medieval European counterparts, Norse women enjoyed notable legal leverage. They could own property, inherit land, and yes, leave a husband who was too fond of lace or lacked, let's say, berserker energy in the bedroom. So, if you were a Viking man and wanted to keep your marriage, the expectations were clear. No skirts, no softness, and definitely no cuddling unless you conquered something first. And while some feared emasculation, others feared basil. Yes, basil, because sniffing it too much, some believed, could breed scorpions in your brain. In the Middle Ages, people believed that basil could breed scorpions in your brain if you sniffed it too much. In the long and bizarre catalog of medieval medical paranoia, basil, the sweet, fragrant herb, now associated with pesto and overpriced kitchen gardens, held a darker, more unsettling reputation. In parts of medieval Europe, people genuinely believed that smelling too much basil could cause scorpions to grow inside your brain. Yes, not a headache, not a sneeze. A full-blown arachnid infestation in your skull. This wasn't the fringe theory of one eccentric monk. It showed up in multiple herbals and bestiaries of the time. The idea was that basil, though pleasant on the outside, had an internal hot and dry nature. In medieval medicine, those were dangerous qualities. Hot and dry substances could unbalance your humors, stir the bile, and apparently summon internal arthropods. The fear likely stemmed from ancient texts, particularly from Pliny the Elder and Galen, whose writings were filtered through centuries of mistranslation, superstition, and a general inability to separate science from nightmares. Some versions of the myth claim that just smelling basil too frequently could plant the seeds of scorpions in your sinuses, where they would hatch and begin gnawing their way toward your thoughts. Others got more specific. If you left basil under a stone for a few days, a scorpion would appear. Logical conclusion? The scorpion was always inside the basil. You're just helping it escape. Herbal exorcism, if you will. And yet people still used basil. They just did it cautiously, like a cursed blessing. You might plant it in your garden for medicinal or culinary reasons, but you sure as hell didn't snort it. The idea of making a caprese salad would have seemed like black magic. Today, we know basil is harmless, unless you're the type to wage Twitter feuds over pasta sauce authenticity. But in the medieval imagination, herbs were powerful, unpredictable, and potentially lethal. One moment, you're seasoning your stew. The next, you're housing venomous pests in your frontal lobe. Which leads to the bigger truth. Medieval people lived in a world of terror disguised as logic, where food fought itself, animals got lawyers, and herbs plotted against your nervous system. And speaking of logic gone rogue, let's talk about how ancient Athens punished voter apathy with red ropes and public shame. In ancient Athens, it was illegal not to vote, and if you skipped too many assemblies, you could be dragged in by rope dyed red. Democracy, as practiced in ancient Athens, wasn't a passive right. It was a mandatory civic performance. You didn't just get to vote, you were expected to show up and do it every time. And if you didn't, the state had a plan. They sent out men with a long rope soaked in red dye and dragged you back in front of everyone. It's true. Public officials would patrol the city square with a bright crimson rope stretched between them, sweeping through the marketplace like a curtain of shame. Anyone loitering, chatting, or trying to dodge assembly duties would get the dye on their clothes and be instantly marked as a slacker. That red stain was a scarlet letter for civic laziness. This citizen would rather buy figs than preserve democracy. Assembly attendance was more than encouraged, it was enforced. It wasn't just about casting a vote. The Athenian ecclesia expected discussion, debate, and direct decision-making on everything from military campaigns to infrastructure. If you were a male citizen, this was your duty. Refusing to participate made you not just useless, but suspicious. And it wasn't just shame that followed. In some periods, habitual non-participation could lead to legal penalties, fines, restrictions, disenfranchisement. The Athenians took their democracy personally, probably because it was still experimental and terrifyingly fragile. But it's also oddly inspiring. Imagine a society where the problem wasn't low turnout, but too many people crammed into the assembly, eager to argue about grain imports and naval policy. And imagine being so serious about that system that you had a dedicated dye crew enforcing it. Of course, the Athenians had their flaws. Women, slaves, and foreigners weren't allowed to vote at all. But for those who could, participation was expected with the force of law and a splash of aggressive interior decorating. So if you think modern voter turnout campaigns are annoying, just be glad no one's chasing you through the mall with a bucket of red paint. And speaking of civic projects with questionable motivations, wait until you hear what Emperor Caracalla built. A public bath complex so enormous, it included libraries, art galleries, and snack bars. The Roman Spa Day Deluxe Edition. Roman Emperor Caracalla built public baths so enormous they included libraries, art galleries, and snack bars. When Caracalla wasn't busy orchestrating family murders or waging unnecessarily brutal wars, he was relaxing. Or rather, he was redefining relaxation for the entire Roman Empire. Behold the Baths of Caracalla, one of the largest public bath complexes ever constructed, an imperial statement piece so massive and extravagant that it would make your local gym spa look like a moldy broom closet. The place was part temple, part palace, part wellness Disneyland. Stretching across more than 30 acres, the baths featured hot and cold pools, saunas, exercise yards, shaded gardens, fountains, and yes, libraries, art galleries, and snack bars. You could read Cicero, get a massage, look at sculptures, do some laps, grab a bite, and all for a price that was practically symbolic. This was subsidized luxury. Bread and circuses, but wetter. Caracalla's move wasn't purely generous. He needed a popularity boost. He'd just murdered his brother and co-emperor, alienated the Senate, and earned himself a reputation as a violent megalomaniac. So, like many despots before and after him, he tried to buy public affection with massive infrastructure. And what better than a bathhouse so huge it required thousands of slaves, millions of bricks, and its own dedicated aqueduct? The baths weren't just for washing, they were for seeing and being seen. Deals were made there, poets recited verses, bodybuilders posed, senators gossiped. It was the Facebook of ancient Rome, just with more togas and less digital screaming. The whole thing was a marvel of engineering. Heated floors, towering domes, mosaics, columns, luxury sculpted into stone and steam. Visitors came not just to relax, but to feel Roman, to soak in imperial power both literally and figuratively. Ironically, Caracalla himself rarely bathed with the public. The man who gave Rome its grandest public space preferred private luxury, but he knew the optics. Build the bathhouse, and maybe people will forget about the trail of bodies. And speaking of symbols of value and forgetfulness, the Anglo-Saxons had a legal code that proves just how serious they were about honey, because stealing someone's bees, that was worse than rustling their cow. The Anglo-Saxons had a law where stealing someone's bees was worse than stealing their cow. In the minds of the Anglo-Saxons, cows were useful, but bees were sacred. Not just because they made honey, but because honey made mead, and mead made life tolerable. So, if you were reckless or foolish enough to steal someone's bees, you weren't just committing theft, you were committing a crime against joy, and the law responded accordingly. That's right, in early medieval England, stealing someone's cow could land you in serious trouble, but stealing their beehive? That was worse. Cows gave milk, meat, and maybe a gentle moo. Bees gave you sweet gold, divine intoxication, candles for the church, and possibly direct access to God's favor. In a society where honey was more than just a luxury, it was currency, medicine, ritual, and buzzed theology. The buzzing little insects were legally protected like tiny, stinging aristocrats. Laws from the time, including in the laws of Alfred and other early codes, laid out clear, specific punishments for beehive thievery. It wasn't a vague, "don't do it." It was a codified, fine-based offense, and often more expensive than livestock theft. Why? Because livestock was replaceable. Bees were complicated. Bee colonies weren't just taken, you had to find them, smoke them, extract them, and move them without getting swarmed into a coma. It was dangerous and deeply personal. Bees were often kept in handmade hives passed down through families. People knew their bees, named them maybe, bonded with them. So when someone stole a hive, they weren't just taking honey. They were taking ancestry, wealth, and spiritual supply. Even more interesting? If a stolen bee stung you, the law sometimes favored the bee. That's right, bee stings were seen as justified force, self-defense, legally speaking. If you're stealing a hive and get stung, the bee is innocent, and you're the criminal bleeding in the bushes. It wasn't all about honey either. Anglo-Saxon society saw bees as morally upright creatures, industrious, cooperative, divine. In Christian lore, they were viewed as incorruptible insects. Even their wax was blessed. So stealing bees wasn't just theft, it was moral failure, a kind of blasphemy that came with interest. So next time you swatted a bee near your soda, remember, in Anglo-Saxon law, you're messing with something legally, spiritually, and economically above you. And on that sweet, sticky note of reverence, we've officially reached the end of our strange journey through 53 baffling, hilarious, and occasionally unsettling historical facts. From golden peas to fart-based professions, divine rodents to revolving dining rooms, the past reminds us of one simple truth. Humans have always been ridiculous. Gloriously, poetically, insistently ridiculous.